30 doctors had walked in and out of her room in the past 6 months, and not one of them could tell her why she kept collapsing. Each left behind polished words, hollow comfort, and another test sheet with the same verdict, inconclusive. But pain does not wait for permission, and her suffering was not a mystery to her heart. It was a storm trapped behind her eyes, burning quietly like a fading sun. Her name was Ava Hartley, 20 years old, a bright architecture student whose sketchbook was once full of dreams, skylines, and bridges she hoped to build someday. Now her hands sometimes trembled so badly she could barely hold a pencil. From the tall windows of Seattle Grace Memorial Hospital, she could see the city breathing gently under a soft morning mist. The trees in the nearby park shimmered with dew, and beyond them, she could see traffic rolling past, buses sighing at stops, cars crawling along wet asphalt, and bicycles gliding between painted lanes. Life kept moving, unstoppable, even as hers stood painfully still. Her father, Leonard Hartley, was the hospital's chief medical director, a man whose voice could still a crowded hallway, but who stood powerless beside his daughter's bed. To the world, he was the general, the man who led doctors like soldiers in a war against death, the guardian of order, the man who always had answers. But here, with his daughter, he had none. Every evening, he sat by her bedside in silence, his polished shoes still reflecting the hospital's pale lights, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. Some said he ruled the hospital like a fortress. But a fortress cannot shield the heart, and a title cannot heal a child. Ava stared at the ceiling, counting the faint pulse-like flashes behind her eyelids, electrical storms racing through her nerves, stealing her breath without warning. She never screamed, she never complained, she just held on, waiting for the next wave. Outside the hospital's entrance stood a narrow little coffee stand made of cedar wood, warmed by a single yellow bulb and smelling of fresh cinnamon. Its owner, a quiet man in a denim jacket, wiped the counter every morning while watching the hospital doors open and close like a tide. His name was Ethan Miller, a single father no one really noticed. Most people only saw him as the coffee guy, a blur in the background of someone else's busy morning. Yet every day, he watched Ava's father walk in with the same heavy shoulders and tired eyes, and he had begun to recognize pain long before footsteps reached his stall. One rainy afternoon, Ava's wheelchair was pushed down toward the garden for fresh air. The nurses joked softly to lighten her mood, but her smile never reached her eyes. The breeze carried the scent of pine needles and wet grass, the scent of a world she no longer felt part of. As they passed by the coffee stand, Ethan paused mid-sentence while pouring a latte for a nurse. He noticed the faint twitch in Ava's fingers, the slight glassiness in her pupils, the way she braced herself as though she knew something was coming, not fear, but anticipation of another unseen strike. Most people saw a sick girl being taken outside for air. He saw a storm preparing to break. Back in her room, she tried to draw again, her lines shaking, half-finished angles collapsing on paper like her body did in silence. She used to draw skylines of Seattle's waterfront, the Space Needle rising above evergreen trees, but now even the horizon looked unreachable. "Dad," she whispered one evening, her voice thin as silk, "what if I never get better?" "Doctor." Hartley didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, his eyes were not a doctor's eyes, they were a father's eyes begging the world for mercy. "You will," he said, but the words trembled beneath the surface like cracked glass. Outside, ambulances wailed through the drizzle of sunset traffic. Lights flashed against wet pavement, and buses hissed their brakes as if sighing with exhaustion. Seattle was alive, vibrant, humming, moving, but inside this quiet room, time seemed frozen. The storm inside Ava was growing, and soon, someone unexpected, someone overlooked by everyone, would be the only one who recognized its shape. The doctors had numbers, the father had titles, but the man with the answers had no audience yet, and he was only a few steps away. Days passed in a blur of hospital routines. Ava's room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain-soaked air drifting from the park outside. The nurses rotated like clockwork, offering gentle smiles, medication, and instructions that repeated like echoes in her mind. Yet no one noticed the tiny shifts, the subtle spasms in her fingers, the way her eyes followed invisible patterns on the ceiling, the trembling in her legs just before she collapsed. 30 doctors had examined her, tested her, scanned her, but all had missed the same thing. Ava's father, Leonard Hartley, tried tirelessly. He questioned specialists, held endless conferences, and scrutinized every chart with a hawk's precision. Still, the diagnosis eluded him. Each time another doctor shook their head and left, he felt the weight of his title crush him, powerless against a storm he could not see. Meanwhile, outside the hospital's glass doors, Ethan Miller polished cups and served warm lattes to hurried nurses, interns, and visitors. His eyes, gentle yet penetrating, often drifted toward Ava's floor. He didn't know her personally, and he had no authority, no credentials, just the quiet awareness of someone who notices patterns. Small things most overlooked, like how she flinched when certain lights flickered, or how she paused mid-breath after a long walk through the garden. Ethan's life had been ordinary. A single father with a small apartment and a café stall near the hospital, he carried the weight of his own loss silently. But his heart was finely tuned to suffering because he had seen it firsthand in his young daughter at home years ago. Something in him whispered, "This girl is slipping through cracks no one can see." One drizzly morning, Ava's collapse was more severe. She had been wheeled toward the outdoor garden, her wheelchair slowly rattling over wet pavement as buses hissed their brakes and rain dripped from the bus stop canopy. Her head jerked violently, her fingers curled spasmodically, and she bit her lip to suppress a groan. The nurses panicked, and Dr. Hartley rushed forward, calling for emergency support. But amid the flurry, Ethan was already observing quietly from the café's edge. His hand rested on a warm cup of coffee, but his mind traced the movement patterns in her tremors, the way her eyes darted in irregular rhythms, the subtle inconsistency in her heartbeat under the nurse's pulse check. Something clicked. He didn't shout. He didn't intervene immediately. He simply remembered what he had learned from quiet observation. The tiniest anomaly, when repeated, often held the key to understanding. Later that evening, Hartley stood by the bay window in Ava's room, looking down at the city lights reflecting on the damp streets. He saw buses crawling along the avenue, headlights glittering like distant stars. Ava slept fitfully in her bed, her hands twitching under the blanket. He felt despair gnawing at his chest. "Why can't anyone fix this?" he whispered. Ethan entered quietly, carrying a coffee for a nurse. He noticed the father's rigid posture and the subtle tremor in his hands. The sight of authority layered with helplessness struck him. Without a word, he asked softly, "Have you noticed how her spasms react to the fluorescent light in the hallway? And the subtle delays in her reactions after moving from one room to another?" Dr. Hartley turned sharply, startled. Who was this man? A cafe worker. What did he know about neurology? I just watch, Ethan continued. I notice patterns. Things people miss because they're looking for the obvious. The room fell silent. Ava shifted in her sleep, and the father's eyes narrowed. Something in Ethan's voice carried no arrogance, only a quiet certainty, a deep empathy that was impossible to ignore. For the first time in months, Hartley felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, finally, someone had seen what everyone else had missed. And that hope, fragile and luminous, was the first step toward changing everything. The morning air in Seattle carried the soft scent of pine and wet asphalt. Buses huffed along the streets, their brakes sighing as they stopped at intersections. Cars wove through traffic, and the city hummed with life, unaware of the quiet storm inside one hospital room. Ava lay in bed, her eyes half closed, trembling from another fainting spell that had come without warning. Dr. Leonard Hartley hovered beside her, exhaustion etched deep into the lines of his face. For months, hope had been a fragile ember. Now it was flickering, threatened by the weight of despair. Then, Ethan Miller entered quietly, a notebook tucked under his arm, his calm eyes observing the subtle twitch of Ava's fingers. He had spent weeks watching, noticing patterns the 30 doctors had overlooked. Now he spoke, gently but with authority born from careful observation. Her nerve signals are disrupted, he explained. The triggers aren't visible in standard scans. But her episodes correspond to specific visual and auditory stimuli, bright fluorescent lights, sudden motion, rapid shifts in sound. Dr. Hartley stared, incredulous. A cafe worker. How could this man see what no doctor had? Yet there was no doubt in Ethan's voice, only quiet certainty and unwavering empathy. Together, they adjusted the room, dimmed lights, softer sounds, calm motions. And for the first time in months, Ava's body relaxed. Her breathing slowed, and her fingers no longer twitched uncontrollably. She opened her eyes fully, meeting her father's gaze. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "Dad, I think I can breathe again," she whispered. The relief that flooded the room was almost tangible. Dr. Hartley's shoulders, long burdened by helplessness, sagged with release. He looked at Ethan, gratitude in his eyes that no words could fully express. In the weeks that followed, Ava's condition improved steadily. She regained strength and began to walk through the hospital gardens again, feeling the soft rain on her face, watching the evergreen trees sway gently. The city skyline glittered across the bay, a reminder that life continued, brighter, richer, and filled with hope. Ethan never sought recognition. He returned to his café, quietly serving lattes and observing the world as he always had. But to Ava and her father, he was a beacon, a reminder that kindness, humility, and attentive care could bridge the gap where wealth and authority failed. Ava returned to her studies, her sketches now depicting not only Seattle's skyline but the gardens where she had felt life return. And her father, once rigid and commanding, learned that listening and trusting could sometimes heal more than any medical expertise. True kindness is often quiet. It does not demand praise. It does not seek attention. It simply sees, listens, and acts. Ethan's gentle observation saved a life when 30 doctors could not. And in that quiet act, he reminded the world that compassion is the most powerful medicine. Even in the darkest moments, there is hope. Even when the world seems indifferent, a single act of attention and care can illuminate a life. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, please comment below and share your feelings. Like this video, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, Kindness Quest, for more real-life stories that inspire hope, compassion, and humanity.